Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by a generous gift in memory of Eric and Mira J. Spector, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation,
Hello JBS viewers, I'm David Harris and this is Defending Israel. And for this program we're going to do things a little differently. I've invited one of my oldest and longest standing colleagues, Dr. Steve Bayme, who is not new to the JBS audience, to come into the studio and to begin a discussion here about my new book, On the Front Lines. So without further ado, I turn the proverbial microphone over to my friend, Steve Bayme. Steve, thanks for coming.
No, David, thanks for having me, really. And I really actually would like to begin with a word of appreciation. For 40 years, you and I were colleagues, close to 40 years, you and I were colleagues at HAC. Throughout that period, just enormous admiration for the kind of leadership, statesman-like presence that you embodied. And while it's commonly said, but in this case really meant, the degree of personal kindness, Menschlichkeit, that you treated your staff members, myself included. So we have an ancient Jewish teaching of Hakarat HaTov, acknowledgement of the good that's been done, and you're at the very top of my list. So thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Of course. Let's talk about the book.
Yes, David. One of the things I think that's really very much on our minds today is towards the end you note that you have your doubts about whether the support for Israel in the immediate aftermath of October 7th would be sustaining. Remarkably, obviously, that was quite prescient on your part. I might not even have agreed at the time that I said it's a case of good versus evil. How do you explain the loss of that support, and how do you think the Jewish community should be reacting to it?
So, Steve, I sometimes try and draw an analogy with a building in Florida that some JBS viewers may remember called Surfside.
Right.
And I don't know the whole story, and none of my family or friends live there. But as I recall, years before what happened, outside engineers came and checked out the building and its foundation and said there were cracks in the foundation. And it's not going to be cheap to fix, but if you don't fix the cracks, we can't guarantee the safety of the building for years to come. And I think in a way, in recent years, I've begun to think about Surfside, but in terms of the Jewish communal structure. There are some cracks in our assumptions about the world, and especially about American society, Western society. I think the cracks are fixable. But like the building engineers that checked out Surfside, it's not an overnight fix. It's not a one-time, we'll do it. It requires some rethinking. And that's why I've been saying, actually, on this program, since October the 7th, we need an October 8th playbook in order to address what we've seen. The October 6th playbook, and you and I were involved for decades in the Jewish communal world, served its purpose. It's not that it was the wrong playbook at the time, but October 7th revealed that those cracks in the foundation are serious, very serious. And if we don't start rethinking our strategies, we may end up with something at some point close to the collapse of the Surfside building. And heaven forbid that should be the outcome, Steve. So it's really about creating an October 8th playbook for the Jewish community as it is, and as it is evolving, because we're seeing startups, we're seeing new faces, new voices. So the old Jewish communal structure is not necessarily going to be the new communal structure in terms of people, organizations, approaches, methodologies. And I think in the end, that's probably healthy and necessary.
Along those lines, the defense organizations, we usually refer to as the community relations or the legacy defense organizations, their strategy really since World War II, long before you and I were on the scene, was very much that of search for allies, build bridges, develop coalitions, find common ground. This was very much in contrast with the 1930s, where the Jews stood alone against an onslaught of anti-Semitism. Well, putting aside Israel for the second and talk about the situation here in the States, one of the things that was really shocking was the degree of hostility, antipathy, certainly anti-Zionism, and it's closely associated with anti-Semitism. What does that say about the community relations strategy of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, which served us well, given the contrast in the 1930s? But suddenly, as you put it, we live in a new world.
So I think the basic assumption that we need allies hasn't changed, Steve. But of course, we need to, in effect, take attendance after October the 7th. We are very proud, and you and I, who are essentially the same age, I'm just slightly older than you are.
A bit, yeah.
But, we're very proud that Abraham Joshua Heschel and Joachim Prinz showed up again and again with so many others in the civil rights struggle. We're so proud that we showed up on immigration and immigration reform, and I can go down a long list. I have to say, since October the 7th, we need to take attendance, if you will, at who showed up for us, and not just remind everyone when we showed up for them. So I think the question is not, do we need allies? Of course we do. Are there allies? There are. But they may not be the same allies that we thought 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. I think, for example, the Indian American community, just to offer an example, which has risen to prominence in America in very significant ways and very rapidly, I think to a very large degree shares a lot of interest, both domestic and foreign, with the Jewish community, the Cuban American community, the Korean American community, the Ukrainian community. I can go down a long list. So allies, absolutely, but instead of chasing after those allies that went MIA, I think we need to spend more time looking for new allies, number one. And number two, much of the strategy, and you and I again both know this, was really built around reason. Meaning, we have a reasonable case to make for Jewish participation in America, equality. So if we can only meet with the key decision makers, presidents of universities, civic leaders, we can reason with them. It's eminently logical. I think after October the 7th, some of those folks cannot be reached by reason alone. I think that we Jews need to roll up our sleeves, quite frankly, and show a little bit more muscle and a little bit more self-respect, and also seek to ensure that when anti-Semitic behavior goes from speech to action, that there are more consequences. And I think to some degree in America today, that C word, consequences, too often is missing.
Well put, David. You alluded to the college campus, university presidents. A lot of us were very disappointed with the reaction of university leaders to the encampments, the anti-Zionist hostility, even attacks upon Jewish students. I wonder here that our traditional allies in terms of the university have always been on the left for two reasons. Number one is that the university itself is a center-left culture. And number two, the Jews themselves, irrespective of the university, have always found themselves on the center leading left. The forces for change in the university, the ones who are saying that the university should not be taking social policy positions, the people who are saying the university is about teaching rather than indoctrination, the people who are saying that the university has lost its mission in favor of political advocacy, those forces are not on the center left. Their forces are much more on the center right. You may have seen the American Association of University Professors, which had had a long-standing policy against academic boycotts, said that very recently that academic boycotts are legitimate in appropriate places, by which they really meant Gaza and Israel. So I wonder, we talk about search for new allies. To what extent should those allies be among what might be called the traditional circles in which Jews feel comfortable, or what coalitions really are, people you aren't necessarily feeling comfortable with, but people who do agree with you on points X, Y, and Z?
It's a great question, which I don't think has a simple, yes or no, check the box answer. But when we talk about the left and the Jewish sort of engagement, if not infatuation over time, we have to parse that. Richie Torres, congressman from the Bronx here in New York.
My congressman.
Your congressman, okay. I didn't realize that. Would certainly define himself as center-left. He would define himself as a progressive, focused on issues of social justice, of equality. And Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar would also define themselves separately as progressive and representing left-wing values of the Democratic Party. So I think the question becomes, Steve, who gets to own the word progressive? And what is the outcome of what can only really be a civil war inside the Democratic Party between those who like me, identify, for argument's sake, Israel and Zionism as progressive issues. And I, for one, don't want linguistically to give the Rashida Tlaibs and Ilhan Omars and their brethren, so to speak, I don't want to give them the gift of labeling them progressives. I don't think there's anything progressive about standing with Hamas, arguably the most regressive force on the planet, in the name of progressivism. So that's not a battle for me to fight. That's a battle within the Democratic Party to fight, number one, and on the university campuses, number two. I think it's a wake-up call not just for American Jews, but for American society, that on October the 8th, the day after, and even before Israel had responded militarily, that 34 organizations on the Harvard University campus joined together in a statement almost as if they had known what was coming. I have no idea if they did. To blame Israel and Israel alone for the barbarism unleashed against Israel. It's a wake-up call that if students at one of our preeminent universities can think this way, something has gone very wrong. So too at the campuses where the American flag was pulled down and the Palestinian flag was raised. And so too at your alma mater, Columbia University, which abdicated responsibility last spring by telling Jewish students, if you don't feel safe on campus to finish the term, you're welcome to go home and finish the term online. Is that a proper response? So the issue is, yes, about Jews, but frankly more about the direction and role of higher education, which is the breeding ground, if you will, for the future of American political, civil, civic, cultural life of the United States of America.
You mentioned Columbia, just worth noting the famous incident of the 4 deans and sub-deans who, while there was a panel on anti-Semitism going on, started mocking the Jewish panelists who were concerned about it, as if it's not a problem. So, yes, I'm disappointed in my alma mater, and I've got a lot of questions about where it's going, but that remains to be seen. David, if we can turn to Israel for a couple seconds. One area where I somewhat disagreed with you in terms of the book is that you were questioned by our former colleague as to the presence of extremists within the Israeli government. No one disputes that in the modern history of Israel, there has not been a coalition government that has actually had extremists within the coalition. There have been extremists in the Knesset, but not in the coalition. When the late Mayor Kahana was elected in 1984, the Likud leadership wanted nothing to do with him, and they were the ruling party at the time. So suddenly you have extremists in the coalition, and as the interviewer makes very clear, that also undermines pro-Israel advocacy within the United States. Namely, can we support a government in which there is such an influential voice is given to the likes of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich? Your response there was that it's not for you to criticize the internal politics of Israel, something we discussed back in the days when we shared our many exchanges back in your office. I question that in terms of forgetting about pro-Israel advocacy, or putting that aside for a second. What does that mean in terms of the Jewish state, Jewish values, the ethos of Judaism, when people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who claim to represent Jewish values and articulate such statements that are considered so abominable by certainly the American public and frankly the American Jewish community?
It's a very fair question, Steve, and I would first of all note, just as a historical framework, that you mentioned Likud, but until 1977, as you know as a historian, Menachem Begin, as the leader of Cherut, Likud, was himself viewed as an extremist, so much so that Ben-Gurion, for years, if not decades, said that he would never include either communists or Menachem Begin and his ilk in any Israeli coalition government. And we know there have been coalition governments from the very beginning.
David, if I can interrupt for a second, though, in 1966, are you going to say that?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No, and in the Six-Day War, to Ben-Gurion's credit, so I'm just saying that there was a time when Begin himself was viewed as so extreme by Ben-Gurion and the establishment. And again, it goes away from your question, but if you look at the restitution debate in Israel with the German government that was launched between Konrad Adenauer and David Ben-Gurion, but Menachem Begin led riots that were actually violent, that involved tear gas and police action in order to try and stop the Israeli government from continuing its negotiations, which led to the Luxembourg agreements of 1952. So I'm simply saying we've seen this before. Having said that, I have no sympathy whatsoever for what either Ben-Gvir or Smotrich represent. My point is really a different one. In a time of war, and since October the 7th, war has been declared against Israel now on 7 fronts. I think the primary focus of American Jews needs to be on how to ensure maximum support for Israel and maximum support for the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is critical to Israel's well-being. If I were an Israeli citizen living in Israel, I have the right, indeed perhaps the prerogative, to express myself differently, because it's my government. I choose to vote for or against it. This is very personal to me, and I get it, completely get it, Steve. But what I was trying to say in the book was, particularly post-October 7th, when it comes to life and death, existential questions, my responsibility first and foremost is not to assess the government as it's assembled. Rather, it is to try and assemble as much support as I can help muster for the just and righteous cause of the state of Israel in an existential war.
That's compelling, David, without question.
That's it. Yeah. But would I vote for them? That's a very different question.
Long term, I do worry about the demographics of Israel.
Who cannot?
Yeah.
Who cannot? But again, on the one hand, you have a democratic system, which we celebrate and cherish as we should. And on the second hand, we have a messy political system in Israel, which gives small parties no incentive to merge with big parties, and every incentive to play I'll be gentle, call it a mediating role, if not a blackmailing role, in how governments are formed. We don't have two main parties, the Labour and the Tories in Britain, or in the US, the Republicans and Democrats. Some have tried to achieve that in Israel, again, as you know. But as long as we have this messy system, and viewers need to be reminded, no Israeli government since the founding has ever been led by a single party.
True.
Without the support of the building blocks, the religious parties, the right-wing parties, the Arab parties, the left-wing parties, and that celebrates Israeli democracy, but it also in a way imperils it.
David, one of the more fascinating chapters on the one hand, and one I think would be surprising to many of our viewers, is your chapter on Polish-Jewish relations. You come out there with a sense of a very benign view of Poland, certainly not the Poland that many Jews remember as being oppressive to Jews. At the same time, the problem with an iconic hero of Poland, namely Lech Walesa. So I'm wondering if you can flesh out for us, how did your views on Poland evolve, and what are they today in light of what we've seen?
Well, I say elsewhere in the book, Steve, I think in a different chapter, which in a way is my favorite chapter at the end, called In a Nutshell,
right,
which are these kind of, Mad Magazine had a kind of snappy answers, for those who remember Mad Magazine. So this was more a kind of quick question, quick answer. And I was asked, what were the thorniest issues I ever dealt with in my 50-year career? And I put, I don't want to frame it as Polish-Jewish, because that somehow preempts Poles from being Jewish. So it's really Poland's relationship with the Jewish world. And that's not just a semantic issue. It's the notion that you can be Polish and Jewish and an integral part of Poland. It's not that I have a benign view of Poland, but I didn't experience Poland the way your father served in the Polish army.
Right.
3.5 million Jews lived in Poland on the eve of the Second World War.
Right.
I was not one of them. My parents were not among them either. My mother was from Moscow. My father was from Budapest. I heard things. I read things. The history is extremely complicated and painful. I would never judge anyone else's view. But at the same time, I tried to take a more nuanced look at it, Steve. And my goal in advocacy was, where possible, to look for friends. It was not simply to debate. You and I were both high school debaters, and
right,
we loved it. But when I went into advocacy, I realized advocacy it should not necessarily be about debating. I don't want to prove people wrong. Where possible, I want to narrow the space between us. And I saw Poland, after 1989, as a potential new strategic partner of the State of Israel. I also saw Poland, after 1989, potentially as a partner to explore Jewish history, Holocaust history, and maybe begin to open a new, brighter chapter in the relations between Poland and the Jewish people. I wasn't naive, although I didn't foresee all of the minefields. I think a lot of progress was made. There are now 10 Jewish communities throughout Poland, beginning with Warsaw, but also in smaller cities. So there is Jewish life. Relations with Israel have been very challenging. There have been ups and downs. But I think Poland is worth engaging, and I devoted probably 40 years of my life to it. I'm not totally satisfied. On the other hand, I think some things have been achieved, Steve. So I'm not going to write off Poland, especially a country that produced, for me, legendary figures like Jan Karski, who every Jew should know his name. And not just Jan Karski, but also Jan Karski. And a country that after 1989, Steve, and this would be a great trivia question for a party, what country outside of Israel has produced 3 consecutive Jewish foreign ministers, and the 4th, who was a Catholic, but who was designated a righteous Gentile by Yad Vashem? And you know the answer? Poland.
Right.
Surprisingly, improbably, but Poland. So I'm simply not writing it off.
For our viewers, if there is one chapter to read, that's the one I strongly recommend. You'll find it really an eye-opener in more than one way. David, I think we have time probably for one more. I'd like to come back to HAC. You and I both came to the agency pretty much at the same time. I think you were there a couple of years before me, then you left, came back. I always worried and wondered about AJC as a Jewish organization. How would you define its Jewish ethos beyond being a defense organization? To what extent was an organization that was made up of Jews, or an organization that really had a Judaic ethos?
I always have to be careful of the last question, Steve. It's the toughest. And in a way, it requires a separate conversation for reasons you know at least as well as I do. I mean, we could flip and I can ask you that question. And I would be fascinated by your answer. But I think that AJC, look, to its credit, was the first, we're told, the first Jewish defense organization that was established in 1906. So clearly, there was a sense of collective responsibility. Maybe it was interpreted a little bit through a class lens because AJC was founded by relatively successful Jews of German background, and not necessarily of East European shtetl background. So English may have been heard more than Yiddish, although there was some Yiddish, but it was principally English, or maybe German at the time. And you and I both know that AJC's historic relationship to Zionism was tenuous. I mean, it was not anti-Zionist like the American Council for Judaism, but it was certainly not in the forefront of cheering for the Zionist success, though as it came closer to realization in 1948, AJC both accepted that new reality and embraced it and supported it. I wanted to bring two, if you will, transfusions to AJC. One was a deeper, more confident sense of Zionism, without apology. I wanted to be an unapologetic Zionist. I didn't want to preface my Zionism with some kind of caveat about my concern for everyone else in the world. My life, I hope, has displayed that concern for others in the world. But I wanted to be an unapologetic advocate for Zionism, Jewish self-determination, and Israel's place in the world. And number two, and this is where we partnered, and I hope you'll agree with me, I wanted to deepen AJC's Jewish neshama, its Jewish soul, not just with a series of headlines, a kind of, if you will, tattoos of Jewish pride, but something deeper. And obviously what you brought as really our resident scholar, you instilled with that gift of teaching that you've had, the ability for many Jews who had not been given a day school education or had not immersed themselves in university or elsewhere in Jewish studies, a kind of very gentle, welcoming, but informed view of the deeper meaning of being Jewish, of why it speaks to each of us, of how it can enrich us. And this brings me, Steve, if I may, broader to the final point before we wrap up. I believe in our post-October 7th playbook that there are several chapters, but the most important chapter after October 7th is for us to deepen the education, the learning, the understanding within the Jewish community of this Jewish journey of ours, of what it means, of why it matters, of what it teaches us, of the kind of North Star it provides us all, or the GPS, if you will, and why Israel should be proudly defended. I'm not now talking about passing moments of this or that statement or politician. I'm talking about the larger project of the reborn Jewish state. We need to reach more young people and their parents and their grandparents and instill this in them. If we do that, we'll be better advocates, Steve. I'd rather start inside and work out than start outside, oh my God, they're coming for us, and then try to explain to young people in particular why they should stand up against the hordes. Let them know why it matters, why it's ennobling, why it's enriching, why it's empowering as a Jew, and the rest will follow. So to me, that's chapter one of the new playbook.
Now, beautifully put, David, and also for me very personally moving. It reminds me of our many discussions and exchanges in your office, outside of your office.
You help me understand that, Steve.
Oh,
so
thanks.
the credit goes to you, and on that, I need to wrap this up, though with Steve Bayme, I could talk for hours, certainly. So Dr. Stephen Bayme, who many of you have seen on this JBS channel for many years, thank you for joining us. It's a privilege and a pleasure for me, Steve, and JBS viewers. This is David Harris, defending Israel, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.
JBS is made possible by viewers like you. This high holiday season, as a thank you for your tax-deductible support of our programming, you can request a signed copy of David Harris's new book, On the Front Lines. Simply visit our website for details. We thank you for your kind support.